Our brain uses sugar for energy, and it needs a lot of energy. But when you consume way too much sugar, this leads to just the opposite effects. If you're consistently consuming too much sugar, it's toxic to the brain. It decreases the ability of the brain to create energy, to use energy. It increases inflammation in the brain. It leads to a loss of controlling your appetite. You're always hungry. And sadly, all of these things are hallmarks of early Alzheimer's. And there's evidence that excessive sugar in the diet, uncontrolled sugar intake, contributes to Alzheimer's disease. So over the course of this episode, I'm going to explain why this occurs, how this occurs, and if you've been on a poor diet consistently for a while, what you can do now to help restore health to your brain, because that can be done. So, hi, my name is Jerry Hickey. I'm a nutritional pharmacist, a pharmacist who has always specialized in nutrition. Welcome to our podcast, and you can find all of the Invite podcast for free wherever you listen to podcasts, or just go to invitehealth.com/podcast. You can also find Invite on Facebook, X, which used to be Twitter, and Instagram at Invite Health. And all the information, the description of this episode is in the description on the website. So, what foods, I guess we should first determine what foods supply too much sugar if you're consistently consuming them. Once in a while, what's the big deal? Come on. But consistent. We're talking consistent. Consistent overconsumption. And also, if you take somewhat sugary foods and you eat too much of them and you're combining them, that leads to the same issue. So obviously, most desserts. Now, I get around that. My desserts could be a handful of walnuts or pecans, fresh walnuts or fresh pecans. A dessert for me is yogurt, good quality yogurt, real yogurt, with blueberries in it. So those are safe desserts, and I'm very satisfied with that. So foods that tend to supply too much sugar break down to sugar too quickly. They call that the glycemic index. So they generally have a high carbohydrate content, and they're generally lacking fiber. Fiber slows down the absorption of sugar, and that's very helpful for preventing a sugar rush. So an example would be instant oatmeal. Oatmeal, real oats take a good 20 to 30 minutes to cook, to break them down. Instant oatmeal, they've removed the fiber, and it's basically just sugar. Cornflakes is another example, or Lucky Charms, cereals like that. Instant mashed potatoes, a lot of sugar. Baked potatoes. Rice milk. Rice milk has a lot of sugar. High glycemic index, I should say. White bread, and believe it or not, whole wheat bread. So you don't want to favor those foods. I mean, they're connected to diabetes and obesity and heart disease and certain cancers. So how do you fix this? Well, hey, mixing foods with a lot of calories, or having a food that's very dense in calories that releases the sugar too quickly, is bad. In fact, let's get into the explanation why that's an issue. When your sugar in your blood is high, a lot of it will rush into your brain. Your brain grabs sugar. It loves sugar. It loves calories. So you have too high a concentration of sugar in the brain. Now, this excess sugar enters what we call the polyol pathway. And let me apologize up front, but to prove my point for why I did this podcast, I have to do some biochemistry in the background, but I'll make it sweet. Okay. So the excess sugar in your brain is entering the polyol pathway. This is a pathway that you see in the eyes of diabetics being overactive, where sugar is converted to sorbitol, and that creates the cataracts you see commonly in diabetics. So the excess sugar in the brain enters the polyol pathway. It's converted to sorbitol, and then that is converted to fructose. And sadly, it doesn't stop there, and we'll get to that later. The excess fructose is very bad for your brain. So let's talk about that. Why would a drink like Gatorade, a sports drink, have fructose? Because in people who do a lot of exercise, they'll use that fructose. But in people who are not doing a lot of exercise and just eating a lot of carbs, that's not happening. So the sugar is being converted to fructose. So you say, oh, wait, there's fructose in fruit. In fact, they call fructose fruit sugar. Should I not eat fruit? No, that's a different thing altogether. Of course, you shouldn't consume too much fruit. But when you eat a piece of fruit, a healthy fruit, and I tend to favor oranges, apples, and blueberries. I'll have 2 servings a day, like an apple and an orange, or at different times a day, like an apple and some blueberries. That's it. I limit it to twice a day. Otherwise, it's too much sugar. But what about fruit in general? Is there an issue with this? Well, when you eat a bit of fruit, most of the fructose is removed from the circulation by the liver, so it's not an issue. One piece of fruit. That's why even diabetics can have a piece of fruit. So, why is excess fructose in the brain related to Alzheimer's? For different reasons. And these are all issues in early Alzheimer's. They're hallmarks of early Alzheimer's. Like key findings in early Alzheimer's would be a drop in energy, insulin resistance. In fact, a number of doctors call Alzheimer's diabetes of the brain, because in diabetes you can't use insulin and your sugar stays high in your blood. And inflammation in the brain. Fructose leads to all three of these. It leads to insulin resistance, it leads to energy issues in the brain, and it leads to inflammation in the brain. All of which, as I said, are hallmarks of early Alzheimer's disease. And indeed, there's evidence, once again, that overconsumption of sugar is a way of really increasing your risk of Alzheimer's disease. So the excess sugar in your diet enters the brain. Over the course of about 40 minutes, it's converted into fructose in what we call the polyol pathway. Now, the fructose, for reasons, increases inflammation in the brain. It impedes energy production in the brain. And it leads to insulin resistance in the brain. So let's discuss this. Let's discuss this. First of all, it causes a disruption in energy production. When you normally eat fats or proteins, they're converted into something that can enter the energy cycle. The energy cycle is called the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. Usually the citric acid cycle. Sugar more directly enters the citric acid cycle, and it's converted to something called ATP. And ATP is the substrate that's made out of your food that contains the energy. So in any cell, your brain cells, which require a lot of energy, any cell, when it requires more energy, you cleave off a phosphate group in the ATP. ATP stands for adenosine tri, meaning 3, adenosine triphosphate, 3 phosphate groups. And an enzyme called AMP kinase cleaves off a phosphate group. This in turn releases electrons, and the electrons that are produced enter the Krebs citric acid cycle. They're part of the Krebs citric acid cycle. They give you the energy. It's electronic energy. It's biochemical energy. So AMP kinase has a second function. It stimulates the production of new mitochondria. So what's a mitochondria? Mitochondria are the power plants where the energy is generated. So when you eat the sugar, it goes through processes and enters this cycle called the Krebs cycle, the citric acid cycle. It's the same thing. You create ATP, so 1 part sugar creates 30 parts ATP. When you need the energy, this enzyme, AMP kinase, cleaves off a phosphate group, and you have electron transfer, and then you have energy. But it also stimulates the production of new mitochondria, and that's where the energy release takes place. So without mitochondria, you don't have energy. Like some cells have thousands of mitochondria because they're so energetic, like in the heart, the brain, the eye, etc. So when you exercise, it generally increases. When you do a rational amount of exercise, let's say it that way, when you do a rational amount of physical activity, you need energy. And that triggers the AMP kinase to go through a cycle that creates new mitochondria so that in the future your body knows your muscles need additional energy. So that's why moderate amounts of exercise make you more energetic and pretty quickly, actually. The body loves exercise, the body loves physical activity. So when you have the fructose, this is where the fructose is a villain.
Imagine the sky going
The
dark
excess
in the
sugar
middle of the
converted
day.
fructose in the brain,
The
and
sun
this happens all over
disappearing
the body.
behind the moon.
It's converted to
casting
a
an eerie
toxin called
twilight across the
methylglyoxal.
land. A total solar eclipse is one
Methylglyoxal
of
binds
nature's
to
most
this enzyme,
spectacular
the enzyme
and rare
AMP
sights.
kinase, and it destroys the
On
enzyme.
April 8th,
So
2024,
instantly, practically,
a historic
you're
total
releasing
solar
less
eclipse
energy. So
will
you're starting to
sweep
get
across North
fatigued.
America.
But in the
plunging parts of
future,
Mexico,
because the
United
enzyme's
States,
destroyed,
and
you're not
Canada
creating additional
into
mitochondria.
daytime darkness.
And
this extraordinary celestial
you have future
event
fatigue,
has
worsening
astronomy
fatigue.
enthusiasts
That's why these people
buzzing
who
with
eat a lot of
excitement.
sugar, they
But
don't have
it
a lot
also
of
has
energy.
experts
They tend
issuing
to have a lot of
critical
fat.
safety warnings.
This
In
also
this
leads to brain
fact-packed
inflammation.
video, we'll explore why there are so many precautions
Now let's
surrounding
get to the
2024
second part of this,
eclipse
which is leptin
and
resistance.
what you need to know to view it safely.
Leptin is
We'll
released
discuss how
in
this
your
eclipse
brain,
differs from the
and
memorable
it affects the
2017
parts of the brain
eclipse
that use sugar for
captivated
energy.
millions. And for
And
those
it
new
affects
to eclipse chasing, we'll cover
in
the
a
basics
way.
of what causes a
So it's in
solar
the
eclipse.
hippocampus
So stick
where
around as we
memory takes
share
place, where
essential
learning
tips
and
to
memory
help
takes
you
place,
get
and
the
short-term
most out
memory
of
storage
this
takes place.
unforgettable experience.
So
Whether
leptin
you plan
is
to travel
important
into
for
the
memory
path of
functions and
totality,
learning.
or catch a partial
But in the
eclipse from your own
hypothalamus,
backyard.
the hypothalamus is
The
in a more
2024
primitive
total
part of
solar
your
eclipse
brain,
is
towards the
one
back of your
celestial
skull,
show
towards the bottom of the back
you
of your
won't want to
skull.
miss.
And the
The Great
hypothalamus
North
is the great
American
regulator of the
eclipse
body. It's
of
involved with
2024.
controlling hormone levels
On
throughout
April
the
8th,
body, like your thyroid
2024, a
hormone for
spectacular
metabolism
celestial event
and sex
will grace
hormones
the
and all these
skies
other
over
hormones.
North America.
So what happens
A total solar
when you have
eclipse,
too much
often
fructose,
referred to as
the leptin
the
doesn't work
Great
well,
North American
and it doesn't
eclipse,
function in the
will cast its
hypothalamus.
ominous shadow
And your
across the
hypothalamus,
continent,
different parts of the
momentarily
hypothalamus
turning
control your
day
hunger
into night along
and
its path.
improve satiety.
This
Satiety is you're
awe-inspiring
satiated,
phenomenon
you're
occurs
not
when
hungry
the moon
anymore.
perfectly
So
aligns
when you have
between the
excess
Earth and the
sugar
sun,
and it's converted
completely
to
blocking the sun's light and
fructose,
creating an
this
ethereal
causes
twilight.
resistance to leptin
The
if you're
eclipse's
constantly
journey
eating
will
sugary
begin
foods.
in
It causes
Mexico
leptin
at
resistance and you're
approximately
always hungry
11:07
and you
a.m.
also start to have
PDT,
memory deficits.
making its first
You're having trouble
landfall
learning.
on the Pacific coast. As the moon's shadow traverses the country, it will cross into Texas around 1:27 p.m. CDT. From there, the path of totality, the narrow strip of land where the sun will be entirely obscured, will